The rescue helicopter's rotors created a whirlwind of dust and debris as Sarah and Thompson approached the aircraft. The crew chief jumped down to help them aboard, his eyes immediately assessing their injuries and the medical equipment they carried. Sarah noticed that the rescue pilot was Captain Jennifer Walsh, another female aviator she knew from flight school. "Good to see you in one piece, Martinez," Walsh called out over the noise of the engines. "We'll have you back at base in 30 minutes. As they lifted off, Sarah looked down at the wreckage of Black Hawk 847. The twisted metal and broken rotor blades told the story of a violent impact, but also of a successful emergency landing that had saved 2 lives. She felt a strange mixture of sadness for the lost aircraft and pride in how she had handled the crisis. The flight medic aboard the rescue helicopter immediately began treating Sarah's shoulder. "Looks like a displaced fracture of the clavicle," he announced after a quick examination. "Painful, but not life-threatening. We'll get you to the medical tent as soon as we land." Thompson was receiving treatment for his knee injury, which appeared to be a severe sprain rather than anything requiring surgery. Despite their pain, both crew members insisted on maintaining custody of the medical supplies they had salvaged from the crash. The antibiotics and surgical equipment were desperately needed at Forward Operating Base Charlie. 25 minutes later, the rescue helicopter touched down at the main airfield. A crowd had gathered near the landing pad, including several of the male pilots who had been openly skeptical of Sarah's abilities. She noticed Captain Robert Hayes among them, the pilot who had refused the morning mission citing safety concerns about the aircraft. As Sarah was helped down from the helicopter, still clutching the bag of medical supplies with her good arm, a reporter from the base newspaper pushed forward. "Captain Martinez, can you tell us what happened out there?" Sarah paused, considering her words carefully. The official investigation would determine the exact cause of the mechanical failure, but she knew that her decision to continue the mission despite the warning signs would be scrutinized. "We experienced mechanical difficulties that resulted in an emergency landing. Sergeant Thompson and I were able to secure the medical supplies and maintain radio contact until rescue arrived." "Is it true that you continued the mission after other pilots had refused to fly that particular aircraft?" the reporter pressed. The question hung in the air as Sarah became aware that many eyes were watching her response. This wasn't just about a helicopter crash anymore. It was about her credibility as a pilot and her place in a male-dominated field. She straightened her shoulders despite the pain, looking directly at the reporter. "I made a command decision based on my assessment of the aircraft's condition and the critical nature of the mission. The soldiers at Forward Operating Base Charlie needed these supplies, and I believed I could deliver them safely." She held up the medical bag with her good arm. "These antibiotics are going to save lives." Colonel Patricia Reynolds, the base commander, stepped forward to address the crowd. Captain Martinez executed a textbook emergency auto-rotation that saved both crew members and preserved critical medical supplies. Her actions today exemplify the highest standards of military aviation. As Sarah was escorted to the medical tent for treatment, she overheard conversations among the gathered personnel. The tone had shifted dramatically from the skeptical whispers of the morning. Phrases like "incredible flying" and "nerves of steel" drifted through the crowd. Dr. Michael Chun, the base medical officer, confirmed the flight medic's diagnosis. Sarah's collarbone was indeed fractured, requiring immobilization for several weeks. "You're grounded for at least 6 weeks while this heals," he explained while fitting her with a sling. "But considering what you've been through today, I'd say you're remarkably lucky." Later that evening, Sarah sat in her quarters writing her official incident report. Her left arm was immobilized, making typing slow and awkward. But she wanted to complete the documentation while the events were fresh in her memory. The mechanical failure had been sudden and severe, but her training had prepared her for exactly this type of emergency. A knock at her door interrupted her work. Captain Hayes stood in the hallway, looking uncomfortable and somewhat embarrassed. "Martinez, I wanted to apologize for this morning. I should have taken that mission myself instead of making safety excuses." Sarah studied his face for a moment before responding. "The aircraft did have mechanical problems, Captain. Your concerns weren't entirely unfounded. But you handled it," Hayes replied. "You got the mission done and brought your crew home. That's what being a pilot is really about." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. I've been thinking that maybe some of us have been unfair in our assessments of the female pilots in this squadron. The admission surprised Sarah, though she kept her expression neutral. We all make judgments based on limited information sometimes. What matters is that we learn from our experiences. The next morning brought news that the medical supplies Sarah had saved had indeed reached Forward Operating Base Charlie. 3 wounded soldiers had required immediate surgery, and the antibiotics she had preserved were critical to their treatment. The base commander specifically mentioned in her daily briefing that Captain Martinez's dedication to mission completion had directly resulted in saving lives. The official investigation into the helicopter crash concluded 2 weeks later. The report found that a manufacturing defect in the main transmission had caused the catastrophic failure, completely exonerating Sarah's decision to continue the mission. The same defect was discovered in 2 other aircraft in the fleet, potentially preventing future accidents. During the investigation period, Sarah noticed a significant change in how she was treated by other pilots on base. The skeptical comments and questioning looks had been replaced by professional respect and inclusion in conversations that had previously excluded her. Several male pilots sought her advice on emergency procedures, acknowledging her expertise in auto-rotation techniques. Captain Walsh visited Sarah during her recovery period, bringing news from other female aviators across the military. Word about your crash landing has spread through the community, she explained. It's being used as an example in flight training programs to show the importance of staying calm under pressure. 6 weeks later, Sarah returned to flight status with a clean medical clearance. Her first mission back was a routine transport flight, but the aircraft assignment was significant. She had been given the newest helicopter in the fleet, and Captain Hayes had specifically requested to serve as her co-pilot. As they completed their pre-flight inspection together, Hayes commented on the thorough maintenance records and updated safety systems. "This bird should give us a smooth ride," he said, then added with a slight smile. "But if anything goes wrong, I feel pretty confident about having you in the pilot's seat." Sarah nodded, adjusting her helmet and running through the startup checklist. The events of that day 6 weeks ago had changed more than just her own perspective on her capabilities. They had demonstrated to an entire squadron that competence and courage weren't determined by gender, but by training, dedication, and the ability to perform under pressure. The helicopter lifted smoothly off the tarmac, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of confidence that came with being airborne. Below them, the same mountainous terrain that had nearly claimed her life stretched out in all directions. Today, however, the landscape looked different. It no longer seemed like a challenge to her abilities, but rather like familiar territory that she had conquered through skill and determination. As they flew toward their destination, Sarah reflected on how one critical mission had transformed not only her own career, but also the perceptions of everyone around her. The woman pilot who had walked away unharmed from a helicopter crash had done more than just survive an emergency. She had proven that excellence in aviation knew no gender boundaries. The radio crackled with routine communications from air traffic control, and Sarah responded with the professional confidence that had always been her trademark. The difference now was that everyone listening knew exactly what that confidence was worth when everything went wrong at 3,000 feet. The acrid smell of burning hydraulic fluid filled Sarah's nostrils as she fought to stay conscious. Her left shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, but her hands were already moving across the emergency shutdown procedures. Years of training had ingrained these actions so deeply that they happened automatically, even while her mind struggled to process what had just occurred. "Thompson, you okay back there?" she called out, her voice hoarse from the dust cloud that had engulfed the cockpit during impact. A groan came from behind her, followed by the sound of someone struggling with their restraint system. "I'm alive, Captain. Banged up my knee pretty good, but I can move. What about you?" Sarah tried to rotate her left shoulder and immediately regretted it. The pain was sharp and focused, likely a dislocation or fracture from the way her body had been thrown against the restraints. "I'll live. We need to get out of here before this bird decides to catch fire." The emergency beacon was already transmitting their location, but Sarah knew it would be hours before any rescue team could reach them in this remote terrain. The immediate priority was getting clear of the aircraft and assessing their situation. She reached up to unlatch her restraint system, grimacing as the movement sent another wave of pain through her injured shoulder. Outside the cracked windscreen, she could see that they had come to rest in a small valley surrounded by rocky hills. The helicopter's tail boom had separated during the crash, and the main rotor blades were twisted and broken. It was a miracle that the aircraft hadn't caught fire immediately upon impact, but the smell of fuel was getting stronger by the minute. "Sergeant, can you get to the medical supplies? We need to grab what we can carry and get clear of this aircraft." Sarah managed to release her restraints and carefully climbed out of her seat. Her left arm hung uselessly at her side, but her legs seemed to be working normally. Thompson was already moving toward the cargo area, limping heavily on his right leg. "Most of the containers are still secured, Captain. The blood products took a hit, but the antibiotics and surgical supplies look intact." He began pulling the most critical items from their mounting brackets, setting them aside for transport. Sarah made her way to the aircraft's emergency kit, extracting the portable radio, flare gun, and first aid supplies with her good hand. The radio crackled to life when she powered it on, but the signal was weak in this terrain. "Base control, this is Black Hawk 847. We are on the ground approximately 15 miles northeast of Forward Operating Base Charlie. Both crew members are alive with minor injuries. Aircraft is a total loss." The response came back filled with static, but Sarah could make out enough to understand that search and rescue teams were being dispatched. The estimated arrival time was 4 to 6 hours, depending on weather conditions. She looked at the sky and noticed that clouds were beginning to build over the surrounding peaks. If a storm moved in, rescue efforts could be delayed even longer. "Captain, we've got company," Thompson said, pointing toward a ridge about half a mile away. Sarah squinted in that direction and felt her stomach tighten. 3 figures on horseback were silhouetted against the skyline, and they didn't appear to be friendly forces. The region was known for insurgent activity, and a downed American helicopter would be an attractive target. Sarah's mind raced through their options. They had limited ammunition, no heavy weapons, and she was operating with only one functional arm. The medical supplies they were carrying would be valuable to anyone, whether friend or enemy. "Grab the antibiotics and as much of the surgical kit as you can carry," Sarah ordered, stuffing the portable radio into a pack she could sling over her good shoulder. "We need to put some distance between us and the aircraft before those riders decide to come down for a closer look." Thompson nodded and began loading supplies into a medical bag. "Which way, Captain? The terrain is pretty rough in every direction." Sarah studied their surroundings, looking for the best defensive position. About 200 yards to the south, she could see a cluster of large rocks that would provide cover and a good view of the surrounding area. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than staying exposed near the crashed helicopter. "We head for those rocks and wait for rescue. If those riders are hostiles, we'll have a better chance of holding them off from an elevated position." Sarah slung the emergency pack over her right shoulder and began walking, each step sending jarring pain through her injured left side. The two of them made slow progress across the uneven terrain. Thompson's injured knee was slowing him down, and Sarah had to stop frequently to rest her shoulder. Behind them, the crashed helicopter sat like a beacon, its broken rotor blades catching the afternoon sunlight. Sarah couldn't help but think about all the people who had questioned whether she was tough enough for this job. 20 minutes later, they reached the rocky outcropping Sarah had identified. It provided good cover and clear sight lines in all directions, but the climb up to the best position was challenging with their injuries. Thompson boosted Sarah up first, then handed the medical supplies up before struggling to climb himself. From their new vantage point, Sarah could see that the riders had moved closer to the crash site. They appeared to be local fighters, armed with rifles, and moving cautiously toward the downed aircraft. She counted at least 5 individuals now, more than had been visible from the helicopter. "They're definitely not friendlies," Thompson observed, watching through a small pair of binoculars from the emergency kit. "Looks like they're more interested in the aircraft than tracking us, though." Sarah nodded, though she knew their situation was far from secure. The fighters would eventually realize that the crew had survived and left the crash site. When that happened, they would begin searching the surrounding area. With her injury and Thompson's damaged knee, they wouldn't be able to move quickly if pursuit began. The portable radio crackled with an incoming transmission. Black Hawk 847, this is Rescue Control. We have fixed-wing aircraft en route to your position. What is your current status? Sarah keyed the microphone. Rescue Control, we have moved approximately 200 yards south of the crash site due to hostile presence in the area. Both crew members are mobile, but injured. We are carrying critical medical supplies that were intended for forward operating base Charlie. Copy that. Black Hawk 847. Be advised that weather is moving in from the west. We may have limited window for extraction. Can you signal your position? Sarah looked at the darkening clouds building over the mountains. A storm would make rescue operations much more difficult, but it might also provide cover from the hostile forces moving around the crash site. She pulled the flare gun from her pack and checked that it was loaded. Rescue Control, I can mark our position with flares when you're in the area. Be advised that we count at least 5 hostile personnel investigating the crash site. The radio went silent for several minutes before crackling back to life. Black Hawk 847, we're sending in 2 Apache gunships ahead of the rescue birds. They'll clear the area before we attempt extraction. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Apache helicopters were specifically designed for situations like this, and their presence would quickly discourage any hostile activity in the area. She settled back against the rocks, cradling her injured arm and watching the crash site below. Thompson was checking the medical supplies they had managed to salvage. We've got about 60% of the antibiotics and most of the surgical kit. If we can get these to Charlie Base, it'll still make a difference for the wounded soldiers there. That's the plan, Sergeant. We didn't come this far to give up now. Sarah's voice was steady despite the pain coursing through her shoulder. She thought about the conversation that morning with the pilots who had refused this mission, claiming it was too dangerous. They had been right about the danger, but wrong about her ability to handle it. The sound of approaching aircraft grew louder, and Sarah could see 2 dark shapes moving fast and low across the valley. The Apache gunships arrived like avenging angels, their presence immediately scattering the hostile forces near the crash site. Within minutes, the area was clear of threats. Black Hawk 847, this is Apache lead. Area is secure. Rescue birds are 5 minutes out, came the transmission over the radio. Sarah fired a red flare into the sky, marking their position clearly against the darkening clouds. The rescue helicopter appeared shortly after, a UH-60 identical to the one that now lay broken in the valley below. As the aircraft settled onto a relatively flat area near their position, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and professional satisfaction. She had completed her mission despite equipment failure, hostile forces, and personal injury. The medical supplies were going to reach the soldiers who needed them, and she and Thompson were going home alive. As they limped toward the rescue helicopter, Sarah knew that this day would change how some people viewed her capabilities as a pilot and as a soldier. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military airfield as Captain Sarah Martinez completed her pre-flight inspection of the UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter. At 28 years old, she had logged over 2,000 flight hours, but today felt different. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and it had nothing to do with the weather. You sure about this mission, Captain? Sergeant Mike Thompson asked, his voice carrying the weight of concern that had been building among the crew for weeks. The recent string of mechanical failures across the fleet had everyone on edge, but Sarah had volunteered for this particular flight when 2 male pilots had backed out citing safety concerns. Sarah adjusted her helmet and looked Thompson straight in the eye. The medical supplies need to reach forward operating base Charlie by noon, Sergeant. Those soldiers are counting on us. She paused, checking her watch. Besides, this bird passed her inspection yesterday. She's ready to fly. The helicopter in question was tail number 847, a 15-year-old Black Hawk that had seen action in 3 different theaters of operation. Her maintenance records showed consistent service, but lately, the entire squadron had been dealing with budget cuts that meant longer intervals between major overhauls. Some of the male pilots had openly questioned whether the older aircraft should remain in service, especially for critical missions. As Sarah climbed into the pilot's seat, she noticed the familiar weight of skeptical eyes upon her. In her 5 years of military service, she had grown accustomed to being the only woman in many situations. But the pressure never completely disappeared. Today, it felt heavier than usual. The base commander had specifically requested that she take this mission after Captain Robert Hayes had refused, claiming the helicopter was too risky for such an important delivery. Flight control. This is Black Hawk 847 requesting permission for takeoff. Sarah spoke into her headset, her voice steady and professional. The response came back immediately, granting clearance for departure. She began the startup sequence, her hands moving with practiced precision across the instrument panel. Sergeant Thompson, serving as her crew chief, settled into his position behind her. Despite his earlier concerns, he had complete faith in Sarah's abilities as a pilot. She had pulled off several challenging rescues in the past year, including a nighttime extraction under enemy fire that had earned her a commendation. Still, the whispers around base suggested that some people believed women pilots were more likely to crack under pressure. The Blackhawk's rotors began their familiar whump 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 as Sarah increased power. She ran through her final checks, monitoring engine temperatures, hydraulic pressure, and electrical systems. Everything appeared normal, just as the maintenance logs had indicated. The aircraft lifted smoothly off the tarmac, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of confidence that came with being airborne. The flight path to forward operating base Charlie would take them through mountainous terrain known for unpredictable weather patterns and occasional enemy activity. Sarah had flown this route dozens of times, but never in an aircraft that had generated so much controversy. The medical supplies in the cargo bay included critical blood products and antibiotics that could mean the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers at the remote outpost. 20 minutes into the flight, Sarah noticed the first sign of trouble, a subtle vibration in the control stick that hadn't been present during takeoff. She immediately scanned her instruments, looking for any indication of mechanical problems. Oil pressure remained steady, engine temperatures were normal, and hydraulic systems showed green across the board. "You feeling that shake, Captain?" Thompson's voice came through the intercom, confirming that the vibration wasn't just her imagination. "Roger that, Sergeant. Keep an eye on the cargo. I'm going to run some diagnostics." Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She had been drilled extensively on emergency procedures, and her instructors had always emphasized the importance of staying calm under pressure. The subtle vibration could indicate anything from a minor imbalance in the rotor system to something more serious. As they continued toward their destination, the vibration gradually intensified. Sarah tried adjusting her flight path and altitude, hoping to find smoother air, but the shaking persisted. She radioed back to base, reporting the mechanical issue and requesting guidance from maintenance personnel on the ground. "Black Hawk 847, this is base control. Maintenance advises that you return immediately if the vibration continues to worsen," came the response from flight operations. Sarah weighed her options carefully. The soldiers at Forward Operating Base Charlie were expecting these supplies, and the weather window for safe landing at the remote outpost was narrow. If she turned back now, it might be another 48 hours before another aircraft could make the delivery. On the other hand, the vibration was definitely getting worse, and pushing forward with a potentially damaged aircraft could put her crew at risk. "Base control, the vibration is manageable at current flight parameters. I'm going to continue to destination and reassess," Sarah transmitted back, making a command decision that she knew would be questioned later. The landscape below changed from flat desert to rolling hills as they approached the mountainous region. Sarah had always loved this part of the flight, where the terrain became more challenging and required greater concentration. Today, however, the increasingly violent shaking of the aircraft made it difficult to enjoy the scenery. 30 minutes later, the vibration had become so severe that Sarah could barely read her instruments. The entire aircraft was shaking like an old washing machine with an unbalanced load. She knew they were in serious trouble, but Forward Operating Base Charlie was now closer than their departure point. "Sergeant, secure everything in the cargo bay. We might be in for a rough ride," Sarah called back to Thompson, who was already working to tie down the medical supplies. "How rough are we talking, Captain?" Thompson asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Before Sarah could respond, a loud metallic grinding sound filled the cockpit, followed by a significant drop in rotor RPM. The engine warning lights began flashing red across her instrument panel, and she felt the aircraft begin to lose altitude despite her inputs on the collective control. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Black Hawk 847 experiencing engine failure and auto-rotating. Sarah transmitted on the emergency frequency, her voice remaining remarkably calm despite the crisis unfolding around her. The ground was rushing up to meet them at an alarming rate. Sarah had trained extensively for this exact scenario, but actual auto-rotation in a damaged aircraft was far more challenging than anything she had practiced in the simulator. She had perhaps 90 seconds to find a suitable landing spot and execute a controlled crash that would give them the best chance of survival. Scanning the terrain below, Sarah spotted a relatively flat clearing about 2 miles ahead. It wasn't ideal, with several large rocks scattered across the area, but it was their best option. She began the delicate process of managing their descent, using the helicopter's forward momentum and the auto-rotating rotor to control their rate of fall. "Brace for impact," she called to Thompson as the ground rushed toward them. Every second counted now, and Sarah drew upon every hour of training she had received. The people who had questioned her abilities were about to find out exactly what she was made of. The helicopter struck the ground with tremendous force, bouncing twice before sliding to a stop against a large boulder. The impact threw Sarah forward against her restraints, and she felt a sharp pain in her left shoulder. Emergency alarms were blaring throughout the cockpit, and she could smell smoke beginning to fill the air. Her first thought wasn't about her own condition, but about getting Thompson to safety and protecting the medical supplies that soldiers were counting on. As the dust settled around the crashed helicopter, Sarah Martinez was about to demonstrate that the critics had been wrong about more than just her flying abilities.